Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I dreamed of my dad-grandpa. The next day, I bought Ouija board and he showed up. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, paranormal stuff, all that. Never believed in it. But something happened recently that's making me question everything I thought I knew. I'm posting this here because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone can help me understand what the hell is going on. It started with a dream. Not just any dream, but one of those that feels so real you wake up disoriented. It was about my grandpa. He passed away when I was a kid, and I don't remember much about him. Just bits and pieces, really. But in this dream, he was so vivid, so clear. He was sitting in his old recliner in the living room, the one that creaked every time he moved. The smell of his pipe tobacco hung in the air, a scent I hadn't thought about in years. He looked at me with those piercing blue eyes of his and said, "There's something I need to tell you, something important." His voice was urgent, almost desperate. I tried to ask him what it was, but no words came out. I was just frozen there, staring at him, feeling this overwhelming sense of dread. He kept repeating, "You need to know the truth." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The room was dark, but I felt like I wasn't alone. I brushed it off as just a bad dream, but it stuck with me all day. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I mentioned it to my mum, and she got this weird look on her face. She said she had a dream about Grandpa the night before too. We both kind of laughed it off, but there was this underlying tension, like neither of us really believed it was just a coincidence. The next day, I was at a flea market with my girlfriend. We were browsing through the usual junk when I saw it, a Ouija board. I don't know what came over me, but I felt this compulsion to buy it. My girlfriend thought it was a dumb idea, but I couldn't leave without it. It was like it was calling to me. We took it home, and she refused to use it, so I waited until she left for work that night. Sitting alone in my apartment, I set up the board on the coffee table. The planchette felt cold in my hands, and I felt this weird energy in the room. I started asking questions, just messing around at first. "Is anyone there?" I asked, feeling ridiculous. The planchette didn't move at first. I was about to give up when it jerked under my fingers. I thought I was imagining it, but then it slid to yes. My heart skipped a beat. I asked, "Who are you?" The planchette moved slowly, spelling out GRANDPA. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone about the dream, and there was no way this thing could know. I asked, "What do you want?" The response came quickly this time. TRUTH. I felt a chill run down my spine. The same word from my dream. I asked, "What truth?" The planchette started moving frantically, spelling out words faster than I could keep up. BURIEDIN BACKYARD. My mind was racing. I remembered my grandpa's old house, the one we sold years ago. It had this huge backyard with a shed. We used to play there as kids. I asked, "What is buried?" The planchette stopped for a moment, then moved slowly, almost reluctantly. ME. I felt like I was going to be sick. Was he saying his body was buried there? It didn't make any sense. He had a proper funeral, a burial, and everything. But then I remembered something. My grandpa had always been a bit of a recluse, and there were rumours about him being involved in some shady stuff. My mum had always brushed it off as gossip, but now I wasn't so sure. I needed answers, so I decided to go to the old house. I found the address online, and it wasn't too far from where I lived. The new owners were an elderly couple, and I concocted some story about wanting to see the place where I grew up. They were surprisingly accommodating and let me wander around. The backyard looked the same, though a bit more overgrown than I remembered. The shed was still there, and I felt this pull towards it. I walked over, my heart pounding in my chest. I started looking around, feeling like a lunatic, but I didn't care. There was an old shovel leaning against the shed, and I grabbed it, starting to dig at the spot where the planchette had stopped. The ground was hard, and my hands were shaking. I kept digging, ignoring the blisters forming on my palms. After what felt like hours, I hit something solid. I cleared the dirt away and found an old, rusted metal box. My hands were trembling as I pried it open. Inside, there were papers, photographs, and a small weathered journal. The papers were old, yellowed with age. They looked like legal documents, deeds, and some letters. But it was the photographs that caught my attention. They were pictures of people I didn't recognize, all looking terrified. Some were bound and gagged, others were bloody and bruised. My stomach churned as I flipped through them. The journal was the last thing I looked at. It was my grandpa's handwriting, no doubt about it. The entries were disturbing, detailing various experiments he conducted on people he had kidnapped. He wrote about torturing them, breaking their wills, and eventually killing them. The last entry was dated a few days before he died, and it simply said, "I know they're coming for me. The truth will die with me." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. My grandpa had been a monster, and I had no idea. I felt sick to my core, like my entire childhood was a lie. I couldn't tell my mum. It would destroy her. I decided to take the box and leave, hoping to find some way to make sense of it all. As I was leaving, the elderly man who owned the house now came out to see what I was doing. I panicked and told him I found some old family stuff buried and that I'd take it with me. He looked at me with this strange expression and said, "Be careful with those old ghosts. Some things are better left buried." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, the photographs, the truth about my grandpa. I had opened a door that should have stayed closed, and now I didn't know how to shut it. Part of me wished I'd never bought that damn Ouija board, but another part of me, the part that felt compelled to keep digging, knew that I couldn't stop now. There was more to uncover, more truths to face, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what I'd find next. After finding the box and the horrifying contents, I knew I couldn't let this rest. I took the box home, hiding it in my closet. My girlfriend noticed I was acting weird, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I just mumbled something about work stress and hoped she'd drop it. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything else. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the terrified faces in those photographs. I needed answers, but I had no idea where to start. I spent hours online trying to find any information about missing persons or unsolved cases from my grandpa's time. It was overwhelming and frustrating, but I couldn't stop. One night, I decided to read through the journal again, hoping I'd missed something. The entries were meticulous, almost clinical in their detail. He wrote about his subjects as if they were lab rats, not human beings. The level of detail was sickening. Methods of torture, psychological experiments, even diagrams of the human body with notes on how to cause the most pain without killing the victim too quickly. It was like something out of a nightmare. There was one name that kept coming up, Subject 13. My grandpa seemed obsessed with this one person. He wrote about how Subject 13 was different, stronger than the others. He mentioned that breaking Subject 13's will was the key to understanding the truth he kept referring to. The last entry about Subject 13 mentioned a final experiment, but it was cut off mid-sentence. I needed to know more about this Subject 13. If I could find out who they were, maybe I could piece together what happened. I decided to visit my mum, hoping she might know something. She'd been sorting through some old family stuff recently, and maybe she'd stumbled on something useful. When I arrived, she was in the kitchen, baking cookies. The smell was comforting, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. We chatted for a bit, and then I brought up the subject of Grandpa. I asked if she remembered anything strange about him, or if he had any close friends or enemies. She looked at me like I was crazy and said he was just a quiet man who kept to himself. I pressed on, asking if she'd found anything unusual while going through his things. She mentioned an old chest in the attic that she hadn't had the heart to open yet. My pulse quickened. Maybe there was something in there that could help me. I asked if I could take a look, and she agreed, though she seemed confused by my sudden interest. The attic was dusty and cramped, filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten memories. The chest was in the far corner, covered in cobwebs. I opened it carefully, my hands shaking. Inside were old clothes, some family heirlooms, and at the bottom, a small leather-bound notebook. I recognized my grandpa's handwriting immediately. This notebook was different from the journal I found. It was more personal, filled with his thoughts and reflections. As I read, I began to see a side of him I'd never known. He wrote about his guilt, his fear of being discovered, and his obsession with finding the truth. He mentioned a man named William, who he described as his mentor and the person who introduced him to these dark practices. One entry stood out. It described a hidden room in the basement of his old house, where he conducted most of his experiments. My heart raced as I read the details. The room was concealed behind a false wall, accessible only through a hidden latch. I knew I had to go back to that house and find this room. I waited until late at night, hoping the elderly couple would be asleep. I parked a few blocks away and crept up to the house, my flashlight in hand. Breaking in was easier than I expected. The back door lock was old and weak, and I slipped inside without making a sound. The house was eerily quiet, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a thunderclap in the stillness. I made my way to the basement, my heart pounding. The air was damp and musty, and I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on me. I found the false wall described in the notebook and located the hidden latch behind an old shelf. It took some effort, but I managed to pry it open. Behind the wall was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I knew whatever was down there, it wasn't going to be good, but I had to know. I had to see for myself. The staircase led to a small, windowless room. The smell hit me first. Decay, mold, and something else I couldn't identify. My flashlight beam revealed a metal table in the center of the room, stained with dark, rusty spots. Chains hung from the ceiling, and there were tools scattered around, the kind you'd find in a butcher's shop. My stomach churned and I had to fight the urge to vomit. In the corner, there was a large wooden crate. I approached it cautiously, feeling a sense of dread. The crate was nailed shut, but I found a crowbar among the tools and pried it open. Inside was a mass of rotting fabric and bones. I staggered back, unable to breathe. It was a body, long dead and decomposed. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, I felt a sudden, intense cold. My flashlight flickered, and I heard a faint whisper. It was a voice, distorted and barely audible. "Help me," it said. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." I realized it was coming from the crate. The bones seemed to shift, as if trying to move. My mind was screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't leave. I had to know the truth. I leaned closer, and the voice became clearer. It was filled with pain and desperation. "Find William! Stop him!" I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voice faded, and the room was silent again. I knew I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in that house another second. I fled up the stairs, out of the house, and didn't stop running until I was safely in my car. Back home, I collapsed on the couch, trying to make sense of everything. My grandpa had been a monster, and there was another man, William, who was somehow involved. I had to find him, had to stop him, whatever it took, but I was terrified of what I might uncover. The truth was out there, waiting for me, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. The next morning, I felt like I'd aged 10 years overnight. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My girlfriend noticed the dark circles under my eyes and asked if I was okay. I gave her a weak smile and told her I wasn't feeling well. I didn't want to drag her into this nightmare. I knew I had to find William. He was the key to understanding my grandpa's twisted actions and, more importantly, stopping whatever horrors he might still be perpetuating. The only clue I had was the old notebook. I spent the entire day scouring its pages for any mention of where William might be. There were several entries that hinted at a cabin in the woods, a place where they conducted their research away from prying eyes. The thought of going to a remote cabin where my grandpa and William had done unspeakable things made my skin crawl, but I had no choice. I had to go there. I packed a bag with some essentials, a flashlight, a knife and my phone, and set out in the late afternoon. The cabin was supposed to be in a dense forest about 2 hours from my town. The drive was tense, my mind racing with fear and anticipation. The sun was setting as I reached the edge of the forest, casting long shadows that seemed to dance menacingly. I parked my car and set off on foot, following the rough directions from the notebook. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. As darkness fell, I switched on my flashlight, its beam piercing through the gloom. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted the cabin. It was old and dilapidated, almost swallowed by the forest around it. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside, filled with dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and foul. I scanned the room with my flashlight, seeing old furniture, scattered papers, and jars filled with strange murky liquids. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I found a door that led to the basement. My stomach churned, but I knew I had to go down. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step. The basement was larger than I expected, filled with old lab equipment and more of those disturbing jars. But what caught my attention was a series of photographs pinned to the wall. They were similar to the ones I found in the box, pictures of terrified people, bound and gagged. But these were more recent. Some of the faces looked hauntingly familiar, like I'd seen them on missing persons posters. My hands shook as I realized William was still active, still torturing and killing innocent people. Suddenly, I heard a noise from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. There was a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and gaunt, with a sickly pallor and hollow eyes. His lips curled into a sinister smile as he stepped into the light. "So, you're Robert's grandson," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "I've been expecting you." It was William. My blood ran cold as I faced the man who had been my grandpa's accomplice. I gripped the knife in my pocket, trying to muster the courage to defend myself. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. William chuckled, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "I want to finish what we started. Your grandfather and I were on the verge of a breakthrough, and you're going to help me achieve it." He moved closer, and I could see the madness in his eyes. I backed away, but he was faster, grabbing me by the arm and yanking me towards an old operating table in the center of the room. I struggled, but he was surprisingly strong for someone who looked so frail. "Let go of me," I shouted, kicking and flailing, but it was no use. He strapped me to the table, his grip like iron. I was trapped, panic flooding my veins. "You don't understand, do you?" he hissed, leaning over me. "Your grandfather discovered something incredible, something that could change everything. But he was weak, afraid. I'm not, and neither are you." He pulled out a syringe filled with a dark liquid and brought it closer to my arm. I thrashed, trying to break free, but the restraints were too tight. "This will only hurt for a moment," he whispered, plunging the needle into my skin. Pain shot through my arm, spreading like fire. My vision blurred and I felt a darkness creeping into my mind. The last thing I saw was William's face, twisted into a grotesque grin. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke up, I was in a different room, still strapped to a table. My body ached and I felt a strange numbness spreading from where the needle had pierced my skin. The room was dimly lit and I could hear muffled voices nearby. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I wasn't alone. There were other people, strapped to tables like me. Some were unconscious, others were moaning in pain. The sight was horrifying. I felt a surge of anger and fear. I had to get out of here, had to stop William. I struggled against the restraints, using every ounce of strength I had left. The leather was old and brittle, and after what felt like an eternity, I managed to break free. I slipped off the table, my legs shaky and weak. I had to find a way out, but I couldn't leave these people behind. I crept towards the door, peeking through the crack. William was in the next room, talking to someone I couldn't see. I had to move quickly. I went from table to table, untying the others and urging them to stay quiet. Some were too weak to move, but others managed to stand, their eyes filled with the same determination I felt. We moved as silently as we could, heading for the stairs. But just as we reached the bottom, a loud crash echoed through the basement. William had heard us. He appeared at the top of the stairs, fury in his eyes. "Stop them!" he screamed, lunging towards us. I grabbed the nearest object, a metal pipe, and swung it at him with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. We raced up the stairs, bursting out of the cabin and into the forest. We ran through the darkness, the sounds of the forest closing in around us. I could hear William's shouts fading behind us, but I didn't stop until we reached my car. We piled in, and I drove as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. We went straight to the police. I told them everything, showed them the notebook and the photographs. They were skeptical at first, but when they saw the other victims and the state they were in, they took us seriously. A raid on the cabin led to the discovery of more evidence, documents, equipment, and the remains of countless victims. William was arrested, his dark secrets finally exposed. The media had a field day, and my family's name was dragged through the mud. But the nightmare wasn't over. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the victims, heard their screams, and in the back of my mind, I knew that there was still more to uncover, more horrors waiting in the shadows. The truth was out there, and it wasn't done with me yet. The days following the raid on the cabin were a blur of police interviews, media frenzy, and sleepless nights. William was locked up, but the terror he had instilled in me was far from over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark still lingered, a presence that clung to me like a shadow. The victims I had rescued were taken to the hospital, and their stories began to emerge. They spoke of unspeakable horrors, experiments that went beyond physical torture, delving into the realm of the supernatural. They mentioned rituals, symbols, and chanting in languages they didn't understand. It seemed that William and my grandfather were involved in something far more sinister than just sadistic experiments. One night, about a week after the raid, I was alone in my apartment, trying to unwind with some TV. My girlfriend had left me, unable to cope with the darkness that now surrounded me. The flickering light from the screen cast eerie shadows on the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, the TV shut off, plunging the room into darkness. My heart raced, and I fumbled for the remote, but it was dead. The lights flickered and then went out completely. I was left in pitch blackness, the silence oppressive. I reached for my phone, but it too was dead. Panic set in as I realized that whatever was happening, it was deliberate. A cold breeze swept through the room, and I felt a presence, something malevolent and ancient. I heard whispers, faint and unintelligible at first, but growing louder and more distinct. They were coming from all around me, voices overlapping and echoing in the darkness. I tried to move, but my body felt paralyzed. The whispers grew louder, and I could finally make out some of the words. The truth, the truth. It was the same phrase my grandpa had used in my dream, the same one I had heard through the Ouija board. The voices were insistent, demanding. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was my grandpa, just as he had appeared in my dream. His eyes were hollow, and his face was twisted in agony. He reached out a hand towards me, and I could see his skin was decayed, rotting away. "You must finish it," he said, his voice echoing in the dark. "Find the truth." I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. The figure of my grandpa began to disintegrate, turning to ash and blowing away in the cold breeze. The room was plunged into silence once more, but the oppressive feeling remained. The lights flickered back on, and my phone buzzed to life. I gasped for breath, my body finally able to move. I grabbed my phone and saw a series of missed calls and messages from my mum. She sounded frantic, begging me to come over. I jumped into my car and drove to her house, my mind racing. When I arrived, she was in tears. She said she'd been having nightmares, visions of my grandpa and William. She showed me a series of drawings she'd made in a trance-like state, horrifying images of rituals, symbols, and dark figures. Among them was a drawing of an old, decrepit church in the middle of the woods. I recognized it immediately. It was the same church that had been mentioned in my grandpa's journal, a place where he and William conducted their darkest rituals. I knew I had to go there to confront whatever evil they had unleashed. My mum begged me not to go, but I had no choice. I had to end this once and for all. The next day, I gathered my courage and drove to the location described in the journal. The church was deep in the forest, far from any civilization. The road was rough and overgrown, and my car struggled to make it through. When I finally arrived, the sight of the church sent chills down my spine. It was a crumbling ruin, overgrown with vines and moss. The windows were shattered, and the doors hung off their hinges. I could feel the weight of the place, the history of suffering and darkness that lingered in the air. I stepped inside, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The interior was worse than I had imagined. The pews were overturned, and the altar was covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I could hear faint whispers echoing through the halls. I made my way to the back of the church, where a trapdoor led down to the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and small, dank rooms. The walls were covered in more symbols, and I could see remnants of rituals, burnt candles, animal bones, and more of those disturbing jars. At the far end of the basement, I found a door that was different from the others. It was reinforced with metal, and strange symbols were etched into its surface. I knew this was the place where the final ritual had been performed. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was lit by flickering candles, casting a dim, eerie glow. In the center was a large stone altar, covered in dark stains. Surrounding it were more jars, filled with a black, viscous liquid. The air was thick with the scent of rot and something else, something metallic and sharp. As I approached the altar, I saw a book lying open on its surface. It was an ancient tome, filled with diagrams and incantations in a language I didn't understand. But as I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The book was open to a page describing a ritual to summon an ancient, malevolent entity. The drawings matched the symbols I'd seen in the church and the basement. I realized with horror that my grandpa and William had been trying to summon something beyond their understanding, and they had succeeded. The entity they had called forth was still here, lingering in the shadows, feeding off the suffering and fear they had created. I had to end it. I grabbed the book and began to read the incantation to banish the entity. The words felt strange and foreign on my tongue, but I forced myself to continue. As I spoke, the room grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see William, his face twisted in rage. He lunged at me, but I managed to dodge, slamming the book shut and throwing it into the fire. He screamed in agony as the flames consumed the book, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. The ground shook, and the walls began to crumble. I could feel the entity's rage, its desperation to remain in our world, but the flames grew stronger, and the symbols on the walls began to glow, banishing the darkness. In a final, desperate act, William threw himself into the fire, his screams echoing through the church. The entity's presence faded, and the room fell silent. The candles flickered and died, leaving me in darkness once more. I stumbled out of the basement, my body weak and my mind reeling. The church was collapsing around me, but I managed to make it outside just in time. As I watched the structure crumble, I felt a sense of relief. The entity was gone, and with it, the horrors that had plagued my family. But the scars remained. The faces of the victims, the memories of the rituals, and the knowledge of what my grandpa had done would haunt me forever. I had uncovered the truth, but it had come at a terrible cost. I had faced the darkness and survived, but I knew it would always be a part of me, a shadow that would never truly fade. In the weeks following the destruction of the church, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. The nightmares persisted, filled with the screams of the victims and the malevolent presence of the entity. My mind was a war zone. The memories of the horrors I had witnessed and the truths I had uncovered, gnawing at my sanity. My mum was deeply affected too. She couldn't shake the guilt and the horror of what her father had done. We barely spoke, the weight of everything hanging between us like a dark cloud. I spent my days isolated, researching, trying to understand the entity my grandpa and William had summoned, hoping to find some way to ensure it was truly gone. One night, as I was poring over old texts and documents, I heard a knock at my door. My heart raced. Visitors had become a rarity. I cautiously opened the door to find a man in his late 40s with a weathered face and piercing eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Evan Michaels, a paranormal investigator who had been following the case since the news broke. "I know what you've been through," he said, his voice calm but firm, "and I think I can help." I was skeptical, but desperation made me invite him in. He explained that he had been researching entities like the one my grandpa had summoned for years. According to him, these entities were ancient, feeding on fear and suffering. Banishing them was one thing, but ensuring they stayed gone was another. "The rituals your grandpa performed were dangerous because they opened a door," he said, his expression serious. "We need to make sure that door is closed for good." Dr. Michaels proposed a cleansing ritual, something to seal the rift and protect against further incursions. He had the necessary materials: ancient symbols, blessed herbs, and a ceremonial dagger. I was reluctant, but I knew we had to try something. The presence of the entity still lingered in my nightmares, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for the right moment to return. We arranged to perform the ritual at my mum's house. She was hesitant but agreed, understanding the necessity. That night, we set up in the living room, the air heavy with the scent of burning sage. Dr. Michaels drew symbols on the floor with chalk, muttering incantations under his breath. As we began the ritual, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. The air grew thick with tension, and I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger. The symbols on the floor began to glow, and I heard faint whispers, just like the ones in the church basement. Dr. Michaels continued chanting, his voice growing louder, more urgent. The whispers turned to screams, and I felt a pressure building in my head, like my skull was about to burst. I could see shadowy figures swirling around us, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Suddenly, one of the figures lunged at Dr. Michaels, knocking him to the ground. The symbols flickered and dimmed, and I felt a surge of panic. I grabbed the ceremonial dagger and slashed at the figure, but my hand passed through it like smoke. The entity laughed, a deep, guttural sound that chilled me to the bone. "You cannot stop me," it hissed. "I will return, and your suffering will be endless." Desperation took over. I remembered the notebook, the incantation my grandpa had used. It was a gamble, but I had no other choice. I began to chant the words, my voice shaking. The entity recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. Dr. Michaels joined in, his voice adding strength to the incantation. The room shook, and the symbols flared to life. The entity screamed, a sound that echoed through the house, rattling the windows. With a final, defiant howl, it was pulled back into the void, the rift sealing behind it. The room fell silent, the oppressive presence lifting. Dr. Michaels and I sat in the aftermath, exhausted but relieved. The ritual had worked, but the experience had left us both shaken. My mum hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. The nightmare was finally over, but the scars would remain. In the days that followed, I tried to pick up the pieces of my life. The media frenzy died down, and the victims began to heal, slowly but surely. I kept in touch with Dr. Michaels, who became a close friend and mentor, helping me navigate the aftermath of the horrors I had faced. One evening, as I was sorting through some old family photos, I found one of my grandpa. He was young, smiling, holding me as a baby. I felt a pang of sorrow and anger, but also a strange sense of closure. The man he had become was a monster, but the man in the photo was someone who had loved me once. I knew I had to move forward, to live my life without being consumed by the darkness of the past. The entity was gone, and the door was closed. But I would never forget the truth I had uncovered, the horrors that had been buried for so long. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. The nightmares had stopped, and the whispers were gone. I closed my eyes, hoping to finally get some restful sleep. But just as I was drifting off, I heard a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "Find the truth." My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding. The room was dark and silent, but the words echoed in my mind. I knew that the battle was over, but the war against the darkness was far from finished. I had faced the horrors of my family's past and survived. Now I had to be vigilant to ensure that the door remained closed, because the truth, once uncovered, can never be buried again. My mother used to call me my little demon. After playing the Ouija board, I found out why. I've always hated my mum's nickname for me, my little demon. It felt like a joke that never landed, a dark humour she insisted on despite my protests. I grew up in a house that seemed to wear a permanent shadow. There was a heaviness in the air, something unspoken but felt. My mum, with her dark sense of humour and strange rituals, only made it worse. We lived in an old, creaky house at the edge of a small town. My mum inherited it from my grandparents, who died under mysterious circumstances before I was born. The townsfolk whispered about our family, suggesting we were cursed or involved in something sinister. I never took those rumours seriously, until recently. It started when I found an old Ouija board in the attic. It was covered in dust, the planchette cracked but still functional. I was alone that night. My mum was working her usual late shift at the hospital. Curiosity got the better of me, and I brought the board down to the living room. I had no idea what I was getting into. I set the board on the coffee table, lit a few candles, and turned off the lights. The atmosphere was already unsettling, but I pressed on. I placed my fingers on the planchette and asked the classic question, "Is anyone there?" At first, nothing happened. I felt foolish, sitting in the dark with this relic from the past. But then, the planchette began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, spelling out a single word, "Yes." A chill ran down my spine. I asked another question, my voice trembling. "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, spelling out, "Demon." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear. "Okay, very funny. What do you want?" The response was immediate. "You." I pulled my hands away, my heart pounding. This had to be a prank. I was home alone, but maybe someone was messing with me. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked. The unease grew, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know more. I placed my fingers back on the planchette. "Why do you want me?" This time, the response was slower, as if whatever I was communicating with was savouring the moment. "Mother." I froze. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. My mum had always been weird, sure, but this was too much. I needed answers. I waited for her to come home, the Ouija board staring back at me like an accusatory eye. When she finally walked through the door, I confronted her. "Mum, I found something in the attic, an old Ouija board. Do you know anything about it?" Her face went pale. She snatched the board from my hands and threw it into the fireplace, where the flames consumed it instantly. "You should never have touched that," she said, her voice trembling. "It belonged to your grandparents. They were into things, dark things." "What kind of things?" I demanded, my fear turning into anger. "Rituals, summonings. They believed they could control demons. But it went wrong. They paid the price, and now you might too. I felt sick. This was too much. Why did you call me my little demon? I asked, dreading the answer. Tears welled up in her eyes. Because when you were born, something changed. You had this aura. They said you were marked. I thought it was just superstition, but now... She couldn't finish her sentence. The room felt colder, darker. I could feel eyes on me, invisible but intense. That night I barely slept, haunted by nightmares of fire and shadows. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Doors would slam shut on their own, whispers filled the halls, and dark figures loomed at the edge of my vision. The worst was the dreams. Vivid, horrific visions of blood, torment, and ancient rituals. Each morning, I woke up more exhausted than before, my body aching as if I had been physically tortured in my sleep. One night, I woke up to find deep scratches on my arms and legs, like claw marks. I couldn't explain them, and my mum just looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity. "It's starting," she said. "The demon is trying to take you." I was losing my grip on reality. Was I going insane? Or was there really something sinister at play? I needed help, but who could I turn to? The townsfolk already thought we were cursed. I was alone in this nightmare. As the days turned into weeks, the occurrences grew more violent. Objects would fly across the room, lights flickered constantly, and the whispers turned into blood-curdling screams. I could feel the presence growing stronger, feeding off my fear and despair. One night, I found my mum in the basement, surrounded by candles and strange symbols drawn in blood. She was chanting in a language I didn't understand. "Mum, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate intensity. "I'm trying to protect you, to bind the demon, but it's too strong. We need help." Desperation led us to a local priest, Father O'Reilly, who reluctantly agreed to perform an exorcism. The ritual was intense, filled with prayers, holy water, and an overwhelming sense of dread. As the priest chanted, I felt a searing pain in my chest, like something was trying to rip its way out of me. The exorcism seemed to work, at least for a while. The house felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The demon was still there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, one night, it did. I woke up to find my mum standing over my bed, a twisted smile on her face. Her eyes were black, void of any humanity. "My little demon," she whispered, her voice distorted and unnatural. "It's time." Before I could react, she lunged at me, her hands cold and strong. I fought back, but she was impossibly strong. In the struggle, I managed to grab a piece of broken glass from my nightstand and slashed at her. She screamed, a sound that wasn't human, and fell to the floor, bleeding and writhing in pain. The next morning, she was gone. No body, no trace, just a pool of blood and a lingering sense of dread. I knew she wasn't dead. The demon had taken her, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me too. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life, but the fear never leaves me. I can feel it watching, waiting, and every now and then I hear her voice, whispering from the shadows. My little demon, Part 2. After my mum disappeared, I decided I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Every creak, every shadow seemed to whisper her name, reminding me of that horrific night. I packed my bags and left town, hoping to find some peace and clarity elsewhere. But the nightmare followed me. I moved into a small apartment in the city, far from the whispers of my hometown. I thought distance would help, that the demon's influence wouldn't reach me there. For a few weeks, things were quiet. I started a new job, made a few friends, and even began to sleep better. But then, the signs started again. It began with the dreams, vivid, terrifying visions of fire and shadows, of my mum's twisted smile and black eyes. Each night, the dreams grew more intense, leaving me drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. I woke up with scratches and bruises that I couldn't explain, as if I'd been fighting for my life in my sleep. One night, I woke up to find the word demon carved into the wall above my bed. The letters were jagged, as if clawed into the plaster. I scrubbed at the marks, but they wouldn't fade. Panic set in. I called Father O'Reilly, desperate for help. He listened patiently and agreed to come visit. When he arrived, he brought with him an air of calm and authority. He inspected the apartment, muttering prayers under his breath. "The presence is strong here," he said, his face grim. "It's attached to you, not the house." We performed another exorcism, but this time it felt different. The air grew heavy, and a sense of malevolence filled the room. As the priest chanted, I felt a burning pain in my chest, worse than before. My vision blurred and I collapsed to the floor, screaming in agony. When I came to, Father O'Reilly was gone. I found a note in his place. "I cannot help you. The demon is too powerful. Seek out the Order of the Black Cross. They are your only hope." Desperation and fear drove me to follow his advice. I researched the Order of the Black Cross, a secretive group, rumoured to deal with the darkest of entities. Their methods were extreme, often dangerous, but I had no choice. I tracked them down to an old abandoned church on the outskirts of the city. The place reeked of decay and neglect, but I pushed forward. Inside, I was met by a man dressed in black robes. His eyes were cold and piercing, as if he could see into my soul. "You seek the Order," he stated, more than asked, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling. "Father O'Reilly sent me. I need help. There's a demon." "We know," he interrupted. "Follow me." He led me deeper into the church, through winding corridors and down narrow staircases until we reached a hidden chamber. The room was dimly lit, filled with ancient texts and ritualistic objects. A group of robed figures stood in a circle, their faces obscured by hoods. The man gestured for me to stand in the center of the circle. "We will attempt to sever the demon's connection to you," he said. "But be warned, this will be painful and there are no guarantees." I nodded, fear gnawing at my insides, but knowing this was my last hope. The figures began to chant in unison, their voices rising and falling in a haunting melody. The air grew colder, and I felt a familiar pressure building in my chest. As the ritual progressed, the pain intensified. It felt like my very soul was being ripped apart. I screamed, my body convulsing as the demon fought to maintain its hold on me. Shadows danced around the room, and the air crackled with dark energy. Suddenly, the pain ceased. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The chanting stopped and the room fell silent. The man in the black robes knelt beside me, his expression unreadable. "It is done," he said. "The connection has been weakened, but the demon is not gone. You must remain vigilant." I thanked them and left the church, feeling both relieved and terrified. The demon's presence was still there, lurking in the background of my mind, but its hold on me was weaker. I knew I had bought myself some time, but for how long? The next few months were a blur of anxiety and constant vigilance. I tried to return to a semblance of normal life, but the fear never left me. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every whisper a promise of doom. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. The mirror in my bathroom was fogged up, but I hadn't taken a shower. I wiped away the condensation and froze. Written in the steam was a single word: soon. I backed away, my heart pounding. The demon was still there, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear. I needed to find a way to end this, once and for all. I returned to the abandoned church, seeking the Order's help once more. This time, I was met by a different member, a woman with piercing blue eyes. She listened to my story and nodded. "There is one final option," she said. "A ritual that can banish the demon entirely, but it is dangerous. You must be willing to face your darkest fears." "I'll do anything," I replied, my voice steady. "I just want this to be over." She led me to a hidden chamber beneath the church, where a complex array of symbols and candles were arranged on the floor. "Lie down in the center," she instructed. "Once we begin, you must not move, no matter what happens." I did as she said, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and determination. The order members formed a circle around me, their chants filling the air with an eerie resonance. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. As the ritual progressed, I felt a familiar pain, but this time it was different. It was deeper, more intense, as if the very essence of my being was being torn apart. I fought to stay still, my body trembling with the effort. Suddenly, the pain stopped, replaced by a cold, empty feeling. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in a dark void. The order members were gone, and I was alone. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and twisting. It was the demon. "Welcome," it hissed, its voice a twisted mockery of humanity. "You have come to face me." I squared my shoulders, trying to muster every ounce of courage I had. "I'm not afraid of you," I lied, my voice shaking. The demon laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You should be," it said. "You belong to me, my little demon." Rage and defiance surged within me. "No," I shouted. "I don't belong to you. I'm taking my life back." The demon lunged at me, its form becoming a whirlwind of shadows and claws. I fought back with everything I had, my anger and determination giving me strength. The battle seemed to last an eternity, each moment a struggle for my very soul. Finally, I felt a shift. The demon's grip weakened, its form becoming less substantial. With one final effort, I pushed it away, banishing it back into the darkness. I awoke on the cold stone floor of the chamber, surrounded by the order members. The woman with blue eyes helped me to my feet, her expression relieved. "You did it," she said. "The demon is gone." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, the constant fear, the haunting presence. It was all gone. I was free. The order warned me to remain cautious, to keep my mind and spirit strong. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. Life slowly began to return to normal after the final ritual. The haunting dreams ceased, and the oppressive presence that had followed me for so long seemed to dissipate. I felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But deep down, a nagging doubt remained. Was it truly over? A year passed, and I started to believe that I had finally escaped the demon's grasp. I moved to a new city, started a new job, and even began to form new friendships. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely happy. But as they say, peace is often the prelude to chaos. One night, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, a sense of foreboding settling in my gut. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a familiar voice spoke. "Hello, my little demon." My blood ran cold. It was my mum's voice, distorted and twisted. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "You know who I am," the voice replied, a sinister laugh echoing through the line. "Did you really think you could escape me?" I hung up, my hands trembling. The terror I thought I had left behind came rushing back. The demon wasn't gone. It had just been waiting, biding its time. I knew I couldn't fight it alone this time. I needed help, but who could I turn to? The Order of the Black Cross had warned me that the demon was powerful, that it would always try to return. I had ignored their advice, thinking I was safe. I had to find them again, but when I returned to the abandoned church, it was deserted. There was no sign of the order, no indication they had ever been there. Desperation led me to research other forms of protection, other ways to keep the demon at bay. I found references to ancient talismans, protective symbols, and rituals. I covered my apartment in these symbols, hoping they would provide some form of barrier. For a while, it seemed to work. The calls stopped, and the nightmares didn't return. But the sense of being watched never left me. I knew the demon was still out there, waiting for a moment of weakness. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock at my door. My heart pounded as I approached, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door cautiously, only to find a single black feather lying on the doormat. I picked it up, and a wave of cold washed over me. The feather dissolved into smoke, and a familiar voice whispered in my ear. Soon, panic set in. I couldn't stay here. I needed to find a place where I could be safe. I packed a bag and left the apartment, driving aimlessly through the night. I ended up in a small motel on the outskirts of town, hoping the anonymity would provide some protection. Sleep was impossible. Every noise, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. In the early hours of the morning, I heard footsteps outside my door. They stopped and a soft tapping began, like someone gently knocking. I held my breath, my heart racing. The tapping continued, growing more insistent. I knew I couldn't stay in the room, but where could I go? I gathered my courage and flung the door open, ready to confront whatever was out there. The hallway was empty. I stepped outside, looking around, but there was no one in sight. As I turned back to the room, I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and a twisted smile spread across its face. I ran, my only thought to get away. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys in my panic. I drove aimlessly, my mind racing. The demon was playing with me, wearing me down. I ended up in a remote area, far from the city, and parked near an old abandoned house. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but I had no other options. I broke in, finding a place to hide. The house was filled with dust and decay, but it felt safer than being out in the open. As I sat in the dark, my thoughts turned to the one person who might be able to help me, Father O'Reilly. I had lost contact with him after the first exorcism, but I had to find him. He was the only one who had ever managed to weaken the demon's hold. The next morning, I started my search. I called the church where he had worked, but they told me he had left months ago, no forwarding address. I visited his last known residence, but it was empty. I felt a growing sense of despair, but I couldn't give up. Finally, I found a clue. An old friend of Father O'Reilly's mentioned that he had gone to a remote monastery, seeking solace and protection. I drove for hours, through winding roads and dense forests, until I reached the monastery. The monks were wary of me, but when I explained my situation, they led me to Father O'Reilly. He looked older, more worn, but his eyes still held that same intensity. "I knew you would come," he said, his voice calm. "The demon has found you again." "I need your help," I pleaded. "I can't fight it alone." He nodded, a grim determination in his eyes. "We will do what we can, but this time you must be prepared for anything." Father O'Reilly and the monks prepared for another exorcism, but this one would be different. They planned a ritual that would not just weaken the demon, but banish it forever. The process would be dangerous, and I had to be ready to face my deepest fears. As night fell, we gathered in the monastery's chapel. The air was thick with incense, and the monks chanted in a language I didn't understand. Father O'Reilly placed protective symbols around me, their power palpable in the air. The ritual began, and I felt the familiar pain building in my chest. But this time, it was accompanied by visions, terrifying, vivid scenes of fire, blood, and darkness. The demon's presence was stronger than ever, its rage palpable. I screamed as the pain intensified, my body convulsing. The monks' chants grew louder, and the room seemed to blur around me. I felt as if I was being torn apart from the inside, my very soul at war with the demon. Suddenly, the pain stopped, replaced by an eerie calm. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in a dark void once again. The demon stood before me, its form more solid, more real than ever. Its eyes burned with hatred, and its smile was a twisted mockery. "You cannot banish me," it hissed. "I am a part of you." "No," I shouted, my voice echoing in the void. "You do not control me." The demon laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You are weak, my little demon. You always have been." Rage surged within me, fueled by the years of torment and fear. "I'm not weak," I screamed. "I'm stronger than you." With those words, I felt a shift, a surge of power. The void around us began to crack, light breaking through the darkness. The demon's form wavered, its confidence faltering. I pushed against it with all my strength, feeling the power of the monk's chants behind me. The light grew stronger, engulfing the demon. It screamed, a sound of pure hatred and despair, as its form disintegrated. The void shattered, and I was pulled back into the chapel. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The monk's chants had stopped, and Father O'Reilly knelt beside me, his expression one of relief. "It's over," he said softly. "The demon is gone." I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me, but also a profound sense of peace. The constant fear, the haunting presence, it was truly gone. I had faced the demon and won. Father O'Reilly and the monks helped me recover, providing support and guidance. They taught me how to protect myself, how to keep my mind and spirit strong. The experience had changed me, but I was determined to move forward. As I left the monastery, I felt a sense of hope for the first time in years. I had faced my darkest fears and come out stronger. The nickname, My Little Demon, no longer held power over me. I was free, but I knew I could never let my guard down. The world is filled with darkness, and there will always be those who seek to bring it into the light. But I was no longer afraid. I had faced the demon and won, and if it ever tried to return, I would be ready. I found Ouija board underground in a hidden bunker. Alright, so I need to get this out, even though it's probably the last thing I should be doing. If you're reading this, maybe you'll understand what I'm going through, or maybe you'll just think I'm crazy. Either way, here goes. A couple of weeks ago, I was helping my friend Mark clean out his late grandfather's old farmhouse. The place was massive, full of dust and memories, and half of it felt like it hadn't been touched in decades. Mark's grandfather was a bit of a recluse in his later years, and he'd spent a lot of time collecting all sorts of weird stuff. We were in the basement, sifting through boxes of mouldy books and rusted tools, when I noticed a small door behind a shelf. It was almost hidden, like someone didn't want it to be found. We cleared the shelf out of the way, revealing a heavy iron door with a lock that had long since rusted over. It took us a good hour to break it open, and when we did, we were met with a damp, musty smell that made us gag. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. We could barely see a few feet ahead with our phone flashlights, but curiosity got the best of us. As we descended, the air grew colder and thicker, like it was full of something unseen. The staircase ended at another door, this one made of old wood with a rusted handle that felt like it might crumble under our grip. Inside was a small room, almost like a bunker. It had a low ceiling, concrete walls, and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light flickered to life, revealing stacks of old newspapers, jars filled with who knows what, and in the centre of the room, an old Ouija board. Now, I've always thought Ouija boards were a joke, something for sleepovers and ghost stories, but this one felt different. It was made of dark wood, with intricate carvings that seemed to move when you looked at them. The planchette was a polished piece of bone, or maybe ivory, with strange symbols etched into it. Mark and I stared at it for a while, before he suggested we try it out. I laughed it off at first, but there was something about that room that made it hard to say no. We sat down on the cold concrete floor, placed our fingers on the planchette, and started asking questions. At first, nothing happened. We asked the usual stuff. Is anyone here? What's your name? But the planchette didn't budge. We were about to give up when it started to move. It was slow at first, like it was struggling to get going. But then, it picked up speed, spelling out a name, ISAAC. We looked at each other, nervous laughter bubbling up. We asked Isaac how he died, and the planchette started moving again, faster this time. It spelled out MURDER. My heart started racing. This was supposed to be a joke, right? but the look on Mark's face told me he was as freaked out as I was. Then, the air in the room changed. It felt heavier, darker, the light flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner. We asked Isaac who murdered him, and the planchette spelled out GRANDPA. I pulled my hands away, shaking. This was too much, but Mark insisted we keep going. He asked Isaac where his body was, and the planchette moved again, this time slower, almost reluctant. It spelled out HERE. We jumped up, backing away from the board. Mark grabbed a crowbar from a shelf and started prying up the floorboards. Underneath was a small, dirt-filled pit. The smell that came out of it was horrendous, like rotting flesh. And there, wrapped in an old, decaying blanket, were bones. Human bones. We ran out of that basement, locking the iron door behind us. We called the police, and they came out to investigate. They confirmed it was a human skeleton, probably decades old. They took the bones for further analysis, and Mark's family hired a team to seal up the basement for good. But that wasn't the end of it. Ever since that day, weird things have been happening. I hear whispers at night, see shadows moving in the corners of my vision. I've had dreams, no, nightmares, of a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, whispering my name. And every time, I wake up with the feeling that something is watching me. I told Mark about it, and he said he's been experiencing the same things. We've tried to move on, to forget about what we found. But it's like, whatever we disturbed won't let us go. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. Maybe sharing it will help. Maybe someone out there has answers. Or maybe I'm just going crazy. Either way, I'll keep updating if anything else happens. Stay safe. And if you ever find an old Ouija board in a hidden bunker, for the love of God, leave it alone. A few days after the police investigation, Mark called me in the middle of the night. His voice was trembling, almost incoherent. He kept saying something about the board and Isaac, but I couldn't make out the details. I rushed over to his place, my mind racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. When I got there, the place was a mess. Mark was sitting on the floor in his living room, clutching the Ouija board we had found. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He kept muttering about how he had tried to get rid of it, but it kept coming back. He had tried burning it, but the flames just fizzled out. He tried burying it in the woods, but the next morning it was back in his living room. He even tried throwing it into the river, but it somehow ended up on his front porch. No matter what he did, the board wouldn't leave him alone. I could see he was losing it, so I took the board from him and promised to take care of it. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I couldn't let my friend go through this alone. I took the board back to my place, figuring I'd figure something out in the morning. That night was the worst night of my life. The whispers started as soon as I got home, soft at first, barely audible, but as the night went on, they grew louder, more insistent. They were coming from the board, taunting me, telling me to use it. I tried to ignore them, but they wouldn't stop. Around 3 a.m, the temperature in my apartment dropped suddenly. I could see my breath in the air, and the whispers turned into full-blown voices. They were screaming now, angry and vengeful. I could hear Isaac among them, his voice clear and desperate, begging for help. The lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I could feel something moving around me, brushing against my skin, whispering in my ear. I grabbed the board and threw it into the closet, slamming the door shut. But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, until I thought my head would explode. I stumbled into the bathroom, turned on the light and splashed water on my face. When I looked up, my reflection wasn't alone. Standing behind me was a dark figure, its eyes glowing red. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the cold, empty bathroom. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed, clutching a baseball bat, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The voices stopped as soon as the sun came up, and the temperature returned to normal, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get rid of the board, once and for all. The next morning, I drove out to an old quarry on the outskirts of town. It was deep and filled with water, the perfect place to get rid of something for good. I tied the board to a heavy rock and threw it into the water, watching it sink into the murky depths. I felt a sense of relief as it disappeared, but it was short-lived. When I got back to my apartment, the front door was open. I stepped inside, and there, sitting in the middle of the living room, was the Ouija board. The rock was gone, and the board was dry, as if it had never been in the water. I backed out of the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. I drove straight to Mark's place, but when I got there, the house was dark and silent. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I used the spare key he had given me and let myself in. The house was eerily quiet. I called out for Mark, but there was no response. I found him in the basement, sitting in front of the old iron door. It was open, and the narrow staircase leading down to the bunker was visible. Mark was staring at it, his eyes vacant, his face pale. He looked up at me and whispered, "I can't escape it. None of us can." Before I could respond, he stood up and walked down the stairs. I followed him, my heart in my throat. The bunker was just as we had left it, but there was something different in the air. It was colder, darker, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Mark went straight to the pit where we had found the bones. The dirt had been disturbed, and there was a fresh, rotting smell in the air. He started digging with his bare hands, muttering to himself. I tried to stop him, but he pushed me away. He unearthed something wrapped in a blanket. It was a small, decayed body, the bones barely holding together. It was Isaac. Mark looked at me, his eyes filled with despair. "We have to help him," he said. "We have to set him free." I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't leave Mark. We took the bones and wrapped them in a clean sheet. We drove out to the old cemetery on the edge of town, digging a grave in the dead of night. We buried Isaac there, saying a prayer over the grave, hoping it would bring him peace. But it didn't. The voices followed us home, louder and more insistent than ever. I can still hear them now, as I write this. They're angry, vengeful, and they won't leave us alone. I don't know what we did wrong, but I know one thing for sure. We're not safe. None of us are. I've been trying to piece together what's happening, but the more I dig, the more it feels like I'm sinking into a nightmare. The voices and shadows haven't stopped, and Mark's condition is getting worse. He's barely coherent now, rambling about Isaac and something else he won't, or can't, name. After burying Isaac, I thought things might get better. I was wrong. The very next night, I woke up to find my apartment filled with a putrid stench, like rotting meat. I gagged as I stumbled through the dark, searching for the source. When I turned on the light in the living room, my blood ran cold. The Ouija board was back, sitting on the coffee table, and the air around it seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed my car keys and drove to Mark's house. I had to talk to him, to figure out what the hell was going on. His house was completely dark when I arrived, even though it was only around 10 p.m. I let myself in and found him sitting in the middle of the living room, staring at nothing. "Mark!" I called out, but he didn't respond. I shook his shoulder and he finally looked up at me. His eyes were hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. "We need to talk," I said. "This isn't just about Isaac anymore. Something else is happening." He nodded slowly, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He led me to the basement, where the iron door stood ajar. The smell of decay was stronger than ever, and the cold air seemed to seep into my bones. We descended the stairs in silence, and when we reached the bunker, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the walls were symbols, drawn in what looked like blood. They were intricate and bizarre, twisting and turning in ways that hurt my eyes to look at. Mark pointed to them and whispered, "It's a curse. Grandpa did something terrible. He summoned something he couldn't control." My mind raced. A curse? Summoning? This was beyond anything I could have imagined. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mark looked at me with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to find out exactly what he did. There's an old journal, Grandpa's diary. It's in the attic. We have to find it." We went back upstairs. and the atmosphere in the house felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on us. The attic was filled with old trunks and boxes, and it took us hours to find the diary. It was a small leather-bound book, the pages yellowed with age. We sat down and started reading. The entries were disjointed and erratic, but it became clear that Mark's grandfather had been involved in some dark occult practices. He wrote about trying to contact spirits, about rituals and sacrifices. The last entry was the most disturbing. November 12th, 1965. I did it. I made contact. Isaac spoke to me. He begged for release, but I couldn't do it. The entity promised power, knowledge, in exchange for keeping Isaac here. I agreed. God forgive me, I agreed. I felt sick. This wasn't just about Isaac. Mark's grandfather had made a deal with something far more sinister, and now it was coming for us. As we read, the air grew colder, and the shadows in the attic seemed to move on their own. Mark's face was pale, his hands shaking. "We have to break the curse," he said. "We have to undo what Grandpa did." But how? The diary didn't say anything about breaking the curse, only about maintaining it. We were at a loss. Then Mark remembered something. "There's an old priest, Father O'Malley. He knew Grandpa. Maybe he can help." The next morning, we drove to Father O'Malley's church. It was a small, weathered building on the outskirts of town. The priest was an old man, his face lined with age and worry. When we explained our situation, he didn't look surprised. "I knew this day would come," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Your grandfather was a troubled man. He dabbled in things he didn't understand. The entity he summoned is ancient, powerful. Breaking the curse won't be easy." Father O'Malley agreed to help us. He told us we needed to perform a ritual to banish the entity, to free Isaac's spirit, but it required specific items. A relic from the church, a lock of hair from a family member, and something of Isaac's. The relic and the hair were easy enough, but finding something that belonged to Isaac was another story. Mark remembered that his grandfather had kept some of Isaac's belongings in a box, hidden in the bunker. We returned to the farmhouse, dread pooling in our stomachs. The bunker felt even more oppressive, the air thick with malevolence. We found the box buried under a pile of old clothes. Inside were a few personal items, a watch, a photograph, and a small toy car. We took the items back to Father O'Malley, and he prepared the ritual. As night fell, we gathered in the church, the air heavy with tension. The priest began chanting in Latin, the words echoing in the dimly lit room. The temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. Mark and I held hands, our hearts pounding. The candles flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw Isaac standing in the corner, his eyes pleading. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and the shadows began to writhe like they were alive. Then, with a final deafening shout, Father O'Malley ended the ritual. The shadows dissipated, and the air grew warmer. The silence that followed was almost deafening. We looked around, waiting for something to happen, but the room remained still. Father O'Malley sighed in relief. "It's done. The entity is banished, and Isaac's spirit is free." But as we left the church, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The voices had stopped, and the shadows were gone. But there was an emptiness inside me, a lingering sense of dread. And when I got home, the Ouija board was waiting for me, sitting in the middle of my living room, as if it had never left. I thought the ritual had worked. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of peace, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But that hope was shattered the moment I saw the Ouija board back in my living room. It was as if the entity was mocking me, telling me that nothing could break its hold. Mark came over immediately when I called him, and his face went pale when he saw the board. "We did everything right," he muttered, shaking his head. "Why is it still here?" We sat in my living room, staring at the board, both of us too afraid to touch it. I suggested calling Father O'Malley, but when I reached for my phone, it wouldn't turn on. Neither would Mark's. Panic started to set in. We were cut off, isolated. It felt like the entity was closing in on us, trapping us in a nightmare we couldn't escape. The lights in my apartment flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The temperature dropped sharply. our breaths visible in the cold air. Then the whispers began again, soft and insidious, crawling into my ears and burrowing into my mind. Help me, release me, you can't escape. Mark and I looked at each other, terror mirrored in his eyes. We knew we had to do something, anything, to end this once and for all. Mark suggested we destroy the board again, but I was hesitant. Every attempt to get rid of it had failed. There had to be another way. Then I remembered something from the diary. One of the entries mentioned a ritual to seal the entity permanently. It was risky, involving a blood sacrifice and an incantation that had to be spoken at the stroke of midnight. We didn't have any other options, so we decided to go for it. We gathered the necessary items: candles, salt, and a knife. The instructions were clear but disturbing. We had to create a circle of salt around the board, light the candles at each cardinal point, and then, using the knife, we had to make a small cut on our palms and let the blood drip onto the board while reciting the incantation. As midnight approached, we set everything up. The room was filled with a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the whispering voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We lit the candles and took our places around the board. My hands were shaking as I picked up the knife. Mark nodded, his face set with grim determination. We made the cuts, wincing as the blade sliced into our flesh. The blood dripped onto the board, and we began to recite the incantation, our voices trembling. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around us like a dark, malevolent storm. The whispers turned into screams, angry and vengeful. The candles flickered and almost went out, but we kept going, chanting louder and louder, desperate to finish the ritual. Just as the clock struck midnight, there was a blinding flash of light. The shadows recoiled, and the screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. For a moment, I thought we had done it. The air felt lighter, and the temperature started to rise. But then, the board began to vibrate, a low, ominous hum that grew louder and more intense. The symbols on the board glowed with a sickly green light, and the planchette started to move on its own, spelling out a message. Youcannotrun. The floor beneath us shook, and a foul stench filled the room, like sulphur and decay. The shadows reappeared, thicker and darker than before, closing in around us. I could feel a cold, clammy hand grip my shoulder, and I screamed, batting it away. But there was nothing there. Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the door. "We need to get out of here now," he shouted. We ran out of the apartment, not stopping until we were outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. We drove to a motel on the edge of town, both of us too scared to go back home. The room was small and dingy, but it felt safe compared to my apartment. We sat on the bed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Why didn't it work?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark shook his head, looking as lost as I felt. "I don't know. Maybe we missed something. Or maybe it's too powerful to be sealed away." We decided to do some more research, hoping to find another way to break the curse. We spent hours on the internet, looking up everything we could about curses, Ouija boards, and the occult. Most of it was useless, but we found a few references to a book that might help. The Codex Maleficarum. According to the forums, it was an ancient text, filled with powerful rituals and spells. It was said to be dangerous, and many of the people who had used it had either gone mad or disappeared. But we were desperate. We had to find it. The next day, we went to the local library, hoping they might have a copy. The librarian gave us a strange look when we asked about it, but led us to a section of old, dusty books in the back. There, among the cobwebs and forgotten tomes, we found it. The cover was black and worn, with strange symbols etched into it. We took the book back to the motel and started reading. The language was old and archaic, but we managed to find a section on banishing entities. The ritual described was even more dangerous than the one we had tried, involving fire, more blood, and the invoking of ancient, powerful names. As we read, the room grew darker, and the air grew colder. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. We knew we had to be careful. One wrong move, and we could end up making things worse. But we didn't have a choice. This was our last hope. That night, we gathered the materials for the new ritual. It felt like we were preparing for a battle, and in a way, we were. A battle for our lives, for our sanity. As midnight approached, we went over the instructions one last time, making sure we understood everything. We drew the symbols on the floor, lit the candles, and made the necessary cuts. The blood dripped onto the book, and we began to chant, invoking the names of ancient gods and demons. The room filled with a dark, oppressive energy, and the shadows danced around us, writhing and twisting. The air grew thick with smoke as we lit the fire, and the symbols on the floor glowed with a fiery intensity. The ground shook, and the walls seemed to close in on us. The voices returned, louder and more insistent than ever, but we kept chanting, pushing through the fear and the pain. And then, just as we reached the climax of the ritual, everything stopped. The smoke cleared, the shadows receded, and the room grew warm. For a moment, there was a profound silence, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. But then, the book snapped shut, and a cold, hollow laugh echoed through the room. The Ouija board reappeared, sitting in the center of the symbols, glowing with a dark, malevolent energy. The planchette moved on its own, spelling out one final message: IAMHEREFOREVER. Mark collapsed, clutching his head and screaming. I tried to help him, but an invisible force knocked me back, slamming me into the wall. The shadows closed in around him, and I watched in horror as they enveloped him, his screams echoing in the darkness. And then he was gone. The shadows vanished, the air grew warm, and the room was silent. I was alone, the Ouija board still glowing ominously in the center of the room. I crawled over to it, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The planchette moved one last time, spelling out a final message: YOURENEXT. I knew then that there was no escape. The entity was too powerful, too malevolent. It had taken Mark, and it would come for me next. I don't know how much time I have left, but I wanted to share my story, to warn others. If you ever find an old Ouija board, especially one in a hidden bunker, leave it alone. Don't touch it. Don't use it. It's not worth the risk. Trust me, I don't know how I'm still alive. I can feel it, lurking in the shadows, watching my every move. It's only a matter of time before it takes me too. But I have to finish this. I have to warn people. After Mark disappeared, I was in shock. I sat in that motel room for hours, staring at the Ouija board, trying to understand what had just happened. Eventually, I pulled myself together and left, taking the book with me. I knew I had to find another way, some way to end this once and for all. I went back to Father O'Malley. He looked horrified when he saw me, the state I was in. I told him everything, about the ritual, about Mark. He listened, his face growing grimmer by the minute. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. "This entity is ancient and powerful," he finally said. "It feeds on fear and despair. Your grandfather unleashed something truly evil, and now it's latched onto you." I asked him what we could do, and he hesitated. "There is one more thing we can try," he said, "but it's dangerous, and it might not work. It involves confronting the entity directly, in the place where it was summoned." That meant going back to the bunker. I felt a wave of nausea at the thought, but I knew we had no choice. We gathered the supplies for the ritual: holy water, candles, and a sacrificial blade. Father O'Malley explained that we needed to lure the entity into a trap, then use the blade to sever its connection to our world. It sounded insane, but it was our last hope. We arrived at the farmhouse just as the sun was setting. The place looked more ominous than ever, shadows creeping across the walls, the air thick with an unnatural chill. We made our way to the basement, the iron door standing ajar, almost inviting. The bunker was just as we had left it, but the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, and the stench of decay was overwhelming. We set up the ritual space, drawing symbols on the floor, placing the candles at the corners and preparing the blade. Father O'Malley began chanting, his voice steady and strong. I held the Ouija board in my hands, my heart pounding. The air grew colder, and the shadows closed in around us. The candles flickered, and the room was filled with a low, ominous hum. And then it appeared. The entity was a dark, amorphous mass, shifting and writhing like a living shadow. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and it seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. It moved towards me, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. Father O'Malley continued chanting, his voice growing louder and more insistent. The entity hesitated, then turned towards him, its eyes narrowing. I knew I had to act quickly. I stepped into the circle, holding the Ouija board out in front of me. "Isaac," I called out, my voice shaking. "We're here to set you free." The entity roared, a sound that shook the very walls of the bunker. It lunged at me, but Father O'Malley threw holy water at it, causing it to recoil. I placed the Ouija board on the ground, and we began the final part of the ritual. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker. The entity thrashed and writhed, its form flickering and shifting. Father O'Malley chanted louder, and I took the blade, making a small cut on my palm. The blood dripped onto the board, and I recited the final incantation. The entity screamed, a sound of pure rage and despair. The shadows writhed and twisted, and for a moment I thought we had failed. But then, the symbols on the board glowed with a bright, pure light, and the entity was pulled towards it, struggling and thrashing. With a final, desperate scream, the entity was sucked into the board, the symbols glowing brighter and brighter. And then, there was silence. The air grew warm, and the shadows receded. The board lay on the ground, the symbols glowing faintly. Father O'Malley and I stood there, panting and shaking. It was over. The entity was trapped. We took the board and the blade and left the bunker, sealing the iron door behind us. We drove to a remote part of the woods and buried the board deep in the ground, marking the spot with a simple cross. "It's done," Father O'Malley said, his voice weary. "The entity is trapped and Isaac is free." I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me, but there was still a lingering sense of dread, a feeling that this wasn't truly over. I knew I had to be careful, to stay vigilant, but for now, I was free. If you're reading this, take my warning seriously. Some things are better left alone. If you ever find an old Ouija board, especially one in a hidden bunker, don't touch it. Don't use it. Leave it alone and hope that it stays buried.